On a night when the wind claws at Dublin's shutters, a door slams, and a life shatters. Cast from her home under a lie, Florence Whitby steps into the rain with nothing but a locket and her will. Her refuge service at a vast Irish estate, whose master, Alistair O'Connell, the most powerful duke in the land, guards a grief as fierce as the sea. In corridors scented with beeswax and secrets, glances strike like sparks. A rumor sharpens into a trap. Duty demands silence. Desire dares an answer. What hidden promise was once whispered by lamplight? And who will pay when truth insists on daylight? Share where you're listening from, and tell us what draws you to period romances. County Dublin, Ireland. Winter of the year 1862. The wind howled like a wounded beast that night, rattling shutters and clawing at the eaves of the narrow brick townhouse on Rose Lane. Cold rain swept through the crooked alleyways, soaking the cobblestones and drenching the gas lamps, whose flickering light cast long, mournful shadows. Inside, amid the creak of aging floorboards and the scent of extinguished hearths' smoke, a young woman stood with trembling hands, facing the closed door that had once been her home. Florence Whitby did not weep. Her eyes, wide and glistening, stared ahead in stunned silence. The storm's fury mirrored in her breathless chest. Her cloak was threadbare and soaked through, clinging to her slender frame. Dark auburn strands of hair had come loose from her braided bun and now framed her pale, resolute face like ribbons of defiance. She held tightly to two things: a small, worn pendant that had belonged to her mother and a folded letter of dismissal, one she knew was forged by the very man who had driven her out. "Take your lies and your airs and find a roof that welcomes the likes of you," her stepfather had hissed, his words thick with gin and venom. "I won't keep a scandal under my roof. Go be a servant if that's all you're good for." And with that, the door had slammed shut behind her. The letter, bearing her late father's faded seal, now manipulated by trembling, dishonest hands, declared that Florence had engaged in conduct unbecoming of a young lady of respectable lineage. It was a death sentence to her reputation. No drawing room would admit her. No family would hire her as companion or tutor, not with such a letter shadowing her steps. She could have collapsed right there, knees to stone and heart in pieces. But instead, Florence turned her face to the rain, squared her shoulders, and stepped into the darkness with all the pride she could still carry. The pendant at her throat glowed dimly with each passing lantern, a final memory of her mother's lullabies and her father's quiet dignity before debt, disgrace, and death had stripped them of everything. By morning, the city had changed. Dublin, under the pale eye of winter light, was gray and unwelcoming. The carriages splashed past her with indifference. Shopkeepers ignored her soaked figure, and the clatter of boots on stone offered no comfort. Still she walked slow, purposeful steps through Marion Square and up toward Lower Gardner Street where the hiring hall stood. Inside, it smelled of mildew, cold dust, and desperation. Dozens of women, younger and older, sat stiffly on benches, hands folded over aprons and skirts that had long lost their color. An older man called names from a wrinkled list, his voice sharp and hurried. Each call led to a pair of eyes lighting up or falling. Florence sat beside a girl of no more than 16 who shivered from hunger. She offered her half of a dry biscuit and asked for nothing in return. Then, like a ripple across still water, silence spread through the room. A tall, stern-looking woman stood at the doorway. Her coat was heavy and dark, her eyes alert beneath a plain bonnet. She spoke with precision, in a voice that left no doubt for anything. "I require a girl for Kara, strong, quiet, willing to work without complaint. The room held its breath. Caramore.
The name alone was enough to steal the air. Whispers said it was a fortress by the sea, guarded by fog, and ruled by a man with no mercy and no smile. The Duke of Caramore, the most powerful noble in the region, perhaps in all of Ireland. Some said he had gone mad with grief. Others said he ruled from shadows and silence. No one seemed to know what was truth. Florence rose. She did not speak at first, only stepped forward with calm determination. The woman looked her over. The worn boots, the wet hair, the eyes that had already seen too much for a woman of 24. There was something about her that did not plead, but dared. "You'll do," the housekeeper said. "We leave within the hour." No questions, no contract, just a nod and a carriage ride that would carry her far from the city and even farther from everything she had once believed her life would become. As Florence climbed into the coach, the wheels shuddered into motion, and the city fell away behind them like a dream fading at dawn. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and exhaled, watching the mist rise and vanish. She did not know where she was going. She did not know whose name she would serve. But she would survive. And the door that had closed behind her would not be the last. It would only be the beginning. Caramore House rose like a fortress of stone and sorrow against the windswept hills of County Wicklow, its chimneys lost in mist and its countless windows veiled by gauze-like curtains. It stood with the authority of an old world carved in gray limestone, with turrets that pierced the fog like watchful sentinels. The estate was immense, encircled by woods so thick and ancient they seemed to hold their breath. Within its walls the air carried a reverent hush, as though the house itself remembered all it had lost and all it dared not speak aloud. For Florence Whitby, her arrival at Caramore was not a beginning, but a threshold. The carriage had left her at the servants' entrance just after midday, but she had not seen the sun, only a pale sky pressing down like a faded sheet and wind that tasted of the sea. She had stepped down with no luggage but her resolve, and immediately been met by the housekeeper, Mrs. Mora Kavanagh, whose posture alone could silence a crowded room. "Stand up straight, speak only when spoken to, and don't go wandering." That was her welcome. By the end of her first day, Florence knew Caramore was not merely a house, it was a kingdom, one ruled not just by the Duke, but by an invisible chain of duty, silence, and unbroken tradition. The servants moved like clockwork. The halls, despite their grandeur, seemed to echo with steps taken too cautiously, as if even their own shadows might betray them. The house itself was labyrinthine, long galleries lined with oil portraits of proud ancestors whose painted eyes never looked directly at the viewer. Rooms with ceilings so high that candle smoke never reached them. Walls of velvet drapes and cold marble that refused warmth. The Duke's study, Florence was told, was strictly forbidden, as was the West Wing. No explanation, only a nod from Mr. Edward Pierce, the butler, whose expression never changed and whose every movement was deliberate, precise, and disapproving. Florence's duties were clear. Rise before dawn, tend to the ash grates, polish the brass on the second floor, wash linens in the morning, fold them in the afternoon. If time allowed, help in the still room with drying herbs or inventory candles under Mrs. Kavanagh's hawk-like supervision. There was no gentleness in the routine, but Florence asked for none. What lingered in the silence between tasks were whispers. Whispers that came like stray gusts from behind half-closed doors or between murmured conversations in the servants' hall. They whispered his name, his grace, the Duke of Caramore. And then silence would fall. A glance would be exchanged. A foot would tap nervously against the stone floor. Alistair O'Connell. Some said he had not laughed since the death of his wife. Others said he had never laughed at all. Some spoke of his time in London, how Parliament once trembled beneath the weight of his voice.
Others insisted he had withdrawn from society entirely, communicating only through letters and sealed commands. But all agreed on one thing: no one spoke to the Duke unless summoned, and no one was summoned unless something was very wrong. Florence did not search for him, she did not ask about him, but she felt his presence like the changing of pressure in a room, subtle, inevitable, as though the very stones of the house whispered his name in her ear when no one else was near. On her third morning, while sweeping the corridor that overlooked the northern courtyard, she saw a riding coat disappearing into the mist, midnight blue, tailored, heavy with damp at the hem. The figure moved swiftly, boots crunching on gravel, and though the hood covered his hair, she knew it was him. The way he carried his shoulders, the authority in each stride, it could belong to no one else. She paused, breath suspended, and though he never turned, something in her stilled. That evening, in the dimly lit scullery, the undercook whispered that His Grace had returned from surveying tenant lands. His gloves had been soaked, his horse restless. He was angry, the undercook said in a hush, as though even the walls might hear. Didn't say a word, just handed his gloves to Pierce and disappeared into the west wing. Florence lowered her gaze to the soap-slick water and said nothing. But she noticed things. A door left slightly ajar. Fresh footprints in the gallery, too large to be any of the servants. A scent that lingered faintly on the air. Leather, pine, and the ghost of tobacco. And once, only once, as she crossed the main stair landing with linens in her arms, she saw a hand resting on the rail, gloved still. She looked up, but too late. The figure was already gone. Yet what unsettled her most was not his presence, but her own awareness of it. She had not come to Caramore to search for anything. She had come to survive. And yet something in her heart, long buried beneath years of silence and endurance, stirred when she caught those brief shadows, a forgotten instinct, a hunger for meaning in the quiet. Unbeknownst to her, on the sixth night, as she sat near the still-room hearth, reading softly from a borrowed prayer book to a young scullery maid too tired to sleep, her voice reached the open hallway beyond. Alistair O'Connell had paused there, half a hallway away, unseen in the shadows. He had not meant to stop. He had meant only to retrieve an old ledger from the cellar archives. But her voice, gentle, untrained, steady, held him still, not for the words, but for their cadence, for the way her tone softened as she read of mercy and forgiveness, for the hush that settled over the still room as her voice wrapped around the embers. He did not linger long. He was not a man who permitted himself such indulgence, but when he turned away, the silence followed him. Florence knew none of this. She simply closed the book and tucked the girl into her cot before returning to her own quarters. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, wondering why her hands trembled, even when she was warm. On the morning of the seventh day, as she knelt to scrub the corridor tiles beneath the drawing-room windows, she heard footsteps approaching, not brisk as Mrs. Caverns would be, not clipped and authoritative like Mr. Pierce, measured, heavy. Her breath caught. She did not look up. The footsteps passed within arm's reach and paused just for a moment, then continued on. Florence's heart beat wildly beneath her apron as she dipped the rag back into the bucket, her eyes never leaving the floor. In that still and storm-shadowed manner,
where secrets slept behind tapestries and dignity clung to every column like ivy. Something was beginning to move. Something silent. Something fragile. And though Florence did not yet understand what it was, she felt it in the tension between one breath and the next, in the unspoken glances, in the footsteps that paused, and in the whispers, always the whispers. Not of scandal, not of curses, but of a man no one dared approach, and a woman no one had yet noticed. But the house had noticed, and the house remembers everything.
The morning had arrived cloaked in silence, not the comforting hush of dawn before the bustle of duty, but a hush thick with waiting, like the moment between lightning and thunder. Caramore's walls, old and wise, seemed to know something Florence did not yet. She moved carefully through the east corridor of the second floor, a basket of folded linens balanced on her hip, her steps soft against the marbled tiles. The corridor windows looked out onto the gardens, but mist obscured everything. The world beyond the glass was blurred, trees becoming shadows, hedges mere silhouettes. It was in that muted grayness, just as she turned the corner past the morning parlor, that she heard it. A soft thump, then another, and then a muffled sob. Florence halted. Her heart quickened, not with fear, but with that peculiar sense of urgency that overtakes the truly kind. She set down her basket and followed the sound. It led her to the last door of the corridor, half tucked between two ornate sconces. The brass handle shone as though recently polished. The sobbing was clearer now, a child's whimper threaded with frustration. Florence knocked gently. "Hello." A pause, then a small, broken voice. "It's stuck. I can't get in." She turned the handle. It didn't budge. Locked from the inside. "I'm locked out," the voice said again, breath hitching between words. "She went away and locked the door, and I... Florence leaned closer. "Can you tell me your name?" Silence, then softly. "Nora." The name settled over Florence like the falling of a curtain. Nora, the niece, the child no one ever saw but who lived on and whispered reports and carefully managed appointments. Florence knelt. "I'm Florence. I work here too. I'll stay with you, all right, until someone comes to open the door." "No," Nora said. "I don't want someone. I want Mama." The words cracked. Florence closed her eyes briefly, her own breath catching, not out of surprise, but of recognition. "Can I tell you a story?" she asked gently. A pause. Then from the other side of the door, a quiet, skeptical, "What kind of story?" "The kind about a castle. One very old, one very proud, one that could hear people's hearts." There was no reply, but the sobs stopped. Encouraged, Florence continued. "They said the castle was made of stone, but it wasn't, not really. It was made of echoes. Every time someone inside laughed, it held that laugh. Every time someone cried, it remembered the tears. And when someone stood outside its door, scared and alone, the castle listened." A small sniffle. "Then how could a castle listen?" Florence smiled softly. "With its windows, of course. They were like eyes, and the staircases were like arms, twisting and reaching and folding around the people who lived inside. When the little girl who lived there cried, the castle tilted its roof just slightly to let her tears roll off like rain." A shuffle behind the door. Nora was now sitting, too, Florence could tell. "What was the girl's name?" Florence hesitated only for a second. Her name was Nora. The door creaked, not open, but softer. "She didn't like the dark," Florence added, "but she was brave, braver than she knew, and she had a secret." "What?" Nora whispered. "She could teach the castle how to laugh again, but only if she stayed very still, just like this,
and listened with all her heart because the castle had forgotten how. They sat in silence for several long seconds, broken only by the faint tick of a clock and the distant murmur of coals being stoked somewhere far below.
Then came footsteps. Brisk, familiar. Mrs. Kavanaugh appeared from around the corner, holding a ring of brass keys and wearing a face like carved granite. "Miss Whitby," she said curtly, "step aside." Florence stood, dipping her head respectfully. The housekeeper unlocked the door with practiced efficiency. It swung open to reveal a girl in a cream nightgown, her hair tousled, her cheeks stained with tears. Nora didn't run into Mrs. Kavanaugh's arms. She simply looked at Florence. "You were kind," the child said plainly. Mrs. Kavanaugh's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with assessment. "Return to your tasks," she said. Florence obeyed, gathering her linens and heading back down the corridor. But as she descended the servants' staircase, her hands trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, from something else, from the way the girl had looked at her, not with suspicion, but with trust. Later that evening, as the last of the dishes were dried and stacked, Florence was called to the housekeeper's office. She entered nervously, smoothing her apron. Mrs. Kavanaugh looked up from her desk. "The child likes you. She is difficult. Most girls cry after an hour with her. You did not." "I didn't mean to overstep," Florence said. "You did not," Mrs. Kavanaugh replied. She set down her pen. "From tomorrow, you'll be assisting in the family wing. You'll help with her reading and sit with her during the afternoons." Florence blinked. The family wing? The heart of the house? Mrs. Kavanaugh said no more. The matter was settled. The following afternoon, Florence entered the family parlor, a room unlike any she'd seen, bathed in soft amber light from tall windows. Its furniture was upholstered in faded blue brocade, and the scent of old books in lavender lingered in the air. Nora sat cross-legged on a chaise, a picture book unopened in her lap. "You came back?" the girl said simply. Florence smiled. "I said I would." They read aloud together, slowly, hesitantly at first, then with growing ease. Nora laughed once, a light startled sound, as Florence made up a silly voice for a fox in the story. It startled even her, and it was then, during that fragile, perfect moment, that Florence felt it, a presence. She turned her head. In the doorway, leaning against the frame, stood a man. Tall, composed, a study in quiet gravity. His coat was black, his cravat loosely tied, as though he had come in haste. His eyes were gray, but not cold. Florence stood instantly, curtsying. Nora glanced up and gasped, then quickly sat straighter. The man stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was low and smooth, like dark velvet. "I see the fox has found its voice again." Florence lowered her gaze. "Your Grace." There was silence, not hostile, but weighted. Then, with a faint lift of one brow, the Duke nodded. "Miss Whitby, I presume." "Yes, Your Grace." His eyes rested on her a beat longer than necessary. "Thank you for today." It was not gratitude spoken for display. It was quiet, sincere, as though the words were foreign to his mouth, rarely used. Florence's breath caught, but she merely nodded. He turned to Nora. "Behaved yourself?" The girl nodded, blushing slightly. The Duke gave no more than a glance, but something had shifted. A boundary, however slight, had been crossed, a line between roles, if not yet souls. As he left, Florence watched him go, not with curiosity, but with awareness. And he, unseen to her, slowed at the corridor's end. His hand rested once again on the polished rail, but this time he did not walk away as quickly. Something had changed, and Caramore, that ancient castle of stone and echo,
had felt it. The rain had not ceased for 3 days. It fell without rest, like a sorrow the sky could no longer contain. Caramore stood still beneath its weight, its towers veiled with mist, its windows strewn with silver threads of water. The sound echoed through the halls, soft, persistent, like breath held too long. Servants moved quietly, their steps muffled by thick carpets and heavier thoughts, and the hearths were kept alight in every room, though no fire seemed strong enough to warm the shadows that lingered at the corners. Florence Whitby walked the corridor toward the library with careful steps, balancing a tray of ledgers and account books that Mrs. Kavanagh had instructed her to return. She had never entered the Duke's private library before, not properly. She had glimpsed its doors, tall and arched, carved with the crest of the O'Connell family. She had heard whispers of its contents, shelves of first editions, maps of forgotten wars, letters bound in faded silk ribbon. But it wasn't the grandeur that made her hesitate at the threshold. It was the light. The room was not empty. A single lamp flickered on a side table. Beyond it, the faint golden glow of a hearth revealed the outline of a figure seated at the far end of the room, his back half turned, head bowed over something in his hands. Florence's instinct was to withdraw, but her feet would not obey. She stood there, motionless, the book still in her arms, the weight of the moment pressing down like the ceiling might lower itself upon her.
The Duke was unaware of her presence. He held a letter. The parchment trembled slightly in his gloved hand, though his body remained still. His eyes moved over the lines again and again, as if searching for something not written. His other hand rested on the arm of the chair, fingers curled. And then softly, too soft for the room, but not for her to hear, he whispered a name, Maeve. It was not spoken like a memory. It was spoken like a wound. Florence's breath caught in her throat. She turned, ready to retreat without a sound. But the wooden floor beneath her creaked, a soft, guilty betrayal. The Duke looked up. Their eyes met, gray and gold, storm and earth. He did not rise. He did not frown. He simply regarded her with the gaze of a man who had seen far too much in life to be startled by the unexpected. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quickly, lowering her eyes, her voice no louder than the rustle of rain beyond the window. "Mrs. Kavanagh asked me to return these volumes." "Leave them," he said. His voice was quiet, horsero, but not unkind. She crossed the threshold, step by step, until she reached the desk nearest the fireplace. She placed the books carefully, aligning them without thought, her hands needing something to do. But when she turned, he was still watching her. "You've read to Nora," he said, as if this was something new he had only recently discovered. Florence nodded. "Yes, Your Grace. She likes you." There was no accusation in the words, only observation. "She's very bright," Florence replied. "She remembers everything, even when she pretends not to." A corner of his mouth lifted. It was not a smile, not truly, but it was something like it. "She does that often," he said, "pretends not to feel." Florence looked at him, then really looked, and saw that the same armor Nora wore in her silences had been crafted in the same forge. The Duke turned his gaze to the fire. "And you, Miss Whitby, what is it that you pretend?" The question was unexpected, and it was not casual. Florence stood very still. She could feel the fire behind her warming her back, and the coldness of the polished floor beneath her shoes. "I pretend," she began slowly, "that I am only what this uniform says I am." He looked at her once more. "And what is it you are truly?" She did not answer. Not at once. She did not yet know how. The silence stretched, not uncomfortably, like a breath held by two people at once. Florence stepped closer to the desk, letting her fingers rest lightly on the worn leather of a book's spine. "I used to play piano," she said at last, her voice barely more than a thought. "Not well enough to perform, but well enough to feel and to make others feel.
"Music is not always for brilliance," he replied. "Sometimes it is only for survival." Florence raised her eyes. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly it." Another silence, another shared truth. He leaned back slightly, the lamplight catching the silver at his temples. In that moment, Florence saw not the Duke of Corrinmore, but a man with tired eyes and shoulders that carried too many names spoken only in memory. "Do you believe in ghosts, Miss Whitby?" he asked. She hesitated. "Not the kind that rattle chains." "No," he said, his voice softer now. "The kind that stay behind a scent, a folded shawl, a silence at supper." Florence did not speak. There was no need. He let out a long breath. "I thought time would quiet the house," he said, "but it only sharpened the corners." Florence looked around the room. The worn edges of the velvet curtains, the brass catch on the fireplace screen dulled from years of use, the book beside his chair with its spine cracked from too many rereadings. "It's not the house," she said gently. "It's the waiting." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in thought. "You see too much." "And I was taught to observe," she replied, "not to speak." "Then you were taught poorly." Their eyes met again, and the stillness between them deepened, not with awkwardness, but with a fragile sort of recognition. Florence stepped back. "I should go." "Yes," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. She reached the door, then paused. Something inside her, something that had long lain quiet, stirred with courage. "I think," she said without turning, "the castle is waiting to laugh again." He said nothing, but behind her she felt the flicker of something, like warmth spreading beneath stone. She left the library without another word. The corridor was empty, the walls thick with velvet silence. But her breath came differently now. The air itself had changed. Behind her the Duke sat still before the fire, the letter forgotten in his lap. And for the first time in years, he realized he was no longer alone in his own house. The frost came suddenly that year, painting the windows of Carrymore with lace, so delicate and cold it could have been woven from breath. The wind had changed its voice, whispering through chimneys and beneath doors with an insistence that unsettled even the oldest corners of the house. Servants moved more quickly, fires were lit earlier, and eyes turned more often to the darkened skies, as if the weather itself had begun to listen. And with the frost came her. Lady Honora Canoncade arrived just after luncheon on the third Thursday of the month.
Her carriage gleaming with fresh lacquer, her gloves pristine, and her expectations even more so, she descended from the steps of her vehicle as if the gravel beneath her shoes were unworthy of contact, lifting her skirts only enough to reveal polished boots and the hint of a smile that carried more calculation than warmth. Her presence was not merely expected, it was orchestrated. The staff had been informed, linens changed, silver polished. A bottle of imported cordial had been brought from the cellar and uncorked to breathe by late morning. Her room, one of the finest in the guest wing, had been perfumed subtly with lavender, and a fresh bouquet of late autumn roses had been placed beside her bed. Florence watched the preparations from the periphery. She was no longer relegated to the scullery, but even her new duties within the family wing did not grant her the freedom to ignore the shift in the house's air. Lady Honora was not simply a guest. She was a possibility, the possibility of an alliance, of a match, of a duchess. She was tall, elegant, the image of a society woman raised on expectation and entitlement. Her hair, a pale honey, was swept into a coiffure too perfect to have been arranged without help. Her traveling gown was of plum silk, the body stiff with embroidery, the skirt layered with velvet and lined with satin. Her scent lingered long after she had passed, and she noticed Florence almost immediately, not as one notices a fil au sul, but the way one notices a mark on polished glass.
On the first morning, Florence passed her in the corridor while accompanying Nora to the library. The child's hand clutched hers tightly. Lady Honora's eyes flicked to the joined hands, then rose slowly to Florence's face. "No nursemaid?" she asked aloud, her voice cool and sharp. "How modern!" Florence curtsied. "Good morning, my lady." Lady Honora did not return the greeting. She turned and walked on, her skirts whispering against the walls. Later that evening, Florence heard her laughter through the drawing-room door, light, practiced, perfectly timed. She did not hear the Duke's voice, only his silence. But silence, Florence had learned, spoke volumes. The days that followed deepened the unease. Lady Honora lingered in rooms she had no reason to be in, seated near the fire in the music parlor, thumbing through books in the library, standing at the base of the stairs just as Florence descended from the family wing, and always her gaze found, measured her, weighed her. The tension grew not from words, but from glances, from the pause in conversation when Florence entered the room, and from the smile Lady Honora gave the Duke when she spoke of loyalty and clean bloodlines, from the tightening of Florence's fingers around the tea tray when her name was not spoken but clearly referenced. Meanwhile, whispers had begun to find their way into the servants' quarters. At first they were quiet, brushed off like dust. She came from nothing. I heard she was dismissed from her last post for reasons unspoken. Her stepfather had to throw her out. The shame was too great. Florence said nothing. She scrubbed harder, walked straighter, but her silence did not protect her from the blade of those words. One afternoon, while assisting Mrs. Kavanagh in sorting old ledgers in the east storage room, Florence stumbled upon a box beneath the shelves. It was lined with linen and filled with letters, bundled carefully with navy ribbon, aged with time but clearly preserved with intention. She had not meant to pry, but one of the letters had slipped slightly from the stack, its seal already broken. Her eyes, though unwilling, caught a single line written in a delicate, familiar hand. "If something happens, promise me you'll remember the music." Florence's breath stilled. She did not read more. She did not touch the rest. She simply wrapped the ribbon more tightly around the bundle and placed it back inside the box, her heart pounding in her chest. She returned to her duties, but that line echoed within her like a song unfinished. That night she could not sleep. The fire in her small room had died to embers, and the wind moaned outside the window. She sat in silence, the letter's words repeating themselves as though whispered directly into her ear. "If something happens, promise me the music."
But before she could begin to make sense of it, a new weight fell upon the house. Mr. Pierce summoned her early the next morning with a look more solemn than usual. He handed her a folded paper, one of the estate notices posted for servant protocol. At the bottom, written in fine script, was her name. She had been requested to report to the drawing-room by the Duke. When she arrived, the room was unusually bright. Morning light poured through the tall windows, illuminating the polished floors and golden picture frames. Lady Honora was already there, seated in a high-backed chair, her posture a portrait of elegance. The Duke stood by the fireplace, one hand behind his back, the other resting on the mantel. Florence curtsied, her pulse like a war drum beneath her skin. "Miss Whitby," the Duke said, his voice even, "we've heard troubling accounts." She said nothing. "There are rumors," Lady Honora added, her tone far too measured to be innocent, "about your history, your dismissal from your previous household, your conduct." Florence met the Duke's eyes. His expression was unreadable, his gaze steady. "My conduct," she said softly, "has never been anything less than honorable." "And your family?" Lady Honora inquired. "Your stepfather?" Florence's jaw tightened. "Whatever my stepfather has told others, he did not tell the truth." The Duke's gaze did not falter, but his silence pressed against her chest. "If you prefer I leave," Florence added quietly, I will go without protest." Lady Honora smiled faintly as if victory had already been claimed. But then the Duke turned. "No," he said, "there will be no dismissal today." His voice was calm, but beneath it something thundered. Lady Honora's lips parted in faint protest, but she said nothing. Florence curtsied once more, her spine straight, her pride intact. As she turned to leave, her hand brushed the edge of a side table. Upon it sat a metronome, still unmoving, and for just a moment she imagined it ticking again, steady, certain, like the echo of music, long silenced. Outside the room, the hallway stretched wide and empty, but the shadows it held were no longer faceless. They had names, secrets, and choices yet to be made. Caramore glittered that evening with a brilliance it had not known in years. The drawing room had been transformed into a jewel box of candlelight and refinement. Chandeliers shimmered with cut crystal droplets, their flickers casting golden halos upon frescoed ceilings. Silver platters gleamed beneath mountains of sugared fruit and delicate cakes. The scent of beeswax, roses, and velvet clung to the air like a perfume too rich to breathe. It was a musical, an occasion designed to remind the county that Caramore remained still a center of influence, that its duke, though reclusive, could summon elegance at will. But beneath the silks and serenades, something darker simmered, something calculated, something waiting. Lady Anna Kincaid, seated at the center of the room in a gown of pale aquamarine, was radiant with expectation. Her gloved fingers barely touched the armrests of her chair. Her laughter floated like a flute above the music, but her eyes remained fixed on Alistair O'Connell, and when her gaze shifted, it found Florence. Florence, dressed in her plain brown uniform with the collar modestly pinned and her hair neatly coiled, moved through the edges of the room, tray in hand. Steps practiced and quiet. She served glasses of cordial, her movements fluid, her presence discreet. Yet she felt it, the eyes, the scrutiny, the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest. From her post beside the pianoforte, Florence caught glimpses of Lady Honora's sharp glance toward her, of Mr. Boyle lingering too close to the footman's service table, of a whisper passed from maid to guest with unusual swiftness. And when the final note of the sonata died into the hush, it happened. A cry, soft, theatrical. "My brooch!" Lady Honora gasped, rising abruptly, one gloved hand clutching at the neckline of her gown. "My grandmother's sapphire!" The room stiffened like a held breath. Servants exchanged glances. Guests murmured. Alistair stood slowly, his posture that of a man who felt a storm forming behind his ribs. "I wore it when I entered," Lady Honora said, her voice rising only enough to carry. "I haven't left this room." Pierce stepped forward at once, offering calm. "Perhaps it fell between the cushions, my lady." Lady Honora's eyes narrowed. "No, someone took it." The words echoed like thunder. In the silence that followed, Florence stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not move. She did not speak. But Boyle did. "I regret the suggestion, Your Grace," he said, stepping forward with a look of pained gravity, "but perhaps we should conduct a search, quietly." Among the staff, Florence felt the eyes swing toward her like blades. Alistair looked at her then, not with anger, but with something worse. Uncertainty. And that more than any accusation cut her deeper than steel. The search was swift and it was brutal. They found the brooch tucked beneath the corner hem of her blanket, wrapped in a handkerchief she did not recognize. It sparkled with cold triumph as Mrs. Kavanagh, pale and silent, held it up between two fingers. Florence stared at it as if it were a serpent. Her lips parted. She shook her head once. No. But no one asked her for a defense. Later that evening in the study, dimly lit by fireplace, Alistair dismissed the rest of the staff and faced her alone.
His hands were folded behind his back. His expression was unreadable. Florence stood before him, her hands at her sides, her posture straight despite the shaking in her knees. "You believe I did this?" she said softly, without accusation. "That I took it?" "No," he said immediately, his voice a low thunder. "No, I don't." "Then why am I here?" Her voice cracked, not with rage, but with the ache of betrayal. "Because," he said, turning to face the fire, "I cannot protect you from what this will become. You have already been questioned, gossiped about, doubted. If I keep you, I invite ruin." Florence drew in a slow breath. "So you are doing this to save me?" He did not answer. "You will send me away," she continued, "and allow them to believe I am guilty?" Alistair turned then, and his eyes, those storm-colored eyes, were full of something that fractured her. "I would rather suffer your hatred," he said, "than watch you be torn apart by society." "Then you never knew me at all," she whispered. He closed the space between them in 3 strides, stopped just short of touching her. His presence was overwhelming, and yet his hands remained still, clasped behind him as if to restrain something even he did not trust. "I know that you are innocent," he said, "but your silence will protect you more than any defense could." "My silence will bury me," she replied. "But very well. If dismissal is what you believe will keep me safe, then dismiss me." He inhaled sharply, as if she had struck him. But he did not deny her. That night she packed her few belongings in silence. A book borrowed from the family library, a shawl mended with invisible stitches, a small photograph of her mother, creased at the corners but treasured still. She did not cry. Only when she stood at Nora's door did her composure falter. The child slept, her curls fanned across the pillow, her cheek pressed to her doll's shoulder. Florence stepped inside on tiptoe, knelt beside the bed, and placed a folded note on the nightstand. She brushed a curl from Nora's brow. "I didn't mean to leave you," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. "You were the only light I had." She kissed the child's temple, stood and left the room before the sob could escape her lips. By morning, the frost had thickened. Her breath bloomed in the air as she walked down the steps of Caramore for the last time. No carriage waited for her, only the open road. Florence did not look back, not even once. Behind her the grand estate loomed, its windows blind to what had been done in its name. And within, in a quiet library bathed in the first light of day, Alistair stood with the brooch in his hand, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with knowledge too late spoken. Dublin was no longer the city Florence had wandered through on that first night of her exile. It had lost the shimmer of mystery, the veil of uncertainty. It was no longer the edge of the unknown. It had become, through necessity and grit, her battleground. And in the bitter chill of late November, with the wind churning cold dust through alleyways and chimneys exhaling breath like old men, Florence Whitby began her second life. She arrived with a single satchel, and the weight of a disgrace she had not earned. There was no welcome, no warm hearth waiting, only the clamor of wheels over stone, the dampness of cracked walls and the scent of rusted iron and baking bread, wafting from streets that did not know her name. But she survived. It began humbly. A woman named Mrs. Tilley, who ran a small glove repair shop on Camden Street, took Florence in after overhearing her asking for directions at the parish doors. The woman had sharp eyes, blunt hands, and a tight braid wound so tightly behind her head that Florence wondered how she ever slept. But her kindness was real. Rough, but real. "You've got clever fingers," Mrs. Tilley muttered the first time Florence restitched a kid leather seam so finely the thread disappeared into the grain. "You'll eat here then,"
Mornings are yours. Afternoons are mine." Florence took the offer. She rose before light to heat the water, scrub the window panes, and take in the neighborhood gloves by the dozen. Most torn by clumsy carriage steps or careless garden gates. She stitched in the back room, surrounded by the scent of polish and dust and dye, her needle rising and falling with rhythm and control, the way she once played scales in a music room she would never enter again. But it wasn't enough. She missed words, not words spoken, but words written, whispered, shared. One evening, after delivering a parcel to a parish, she noticed a group of children crowded near the stone steps, their fingers wrapped around sticks of cold chalk, scribbling symbols into the frost-dusted pavement. A girl, no older than 10, was writing her own name backwards.
Another had drawn a sun, with 7 uneven rays and no face. Florence knelt, not as a teacher, not as a noblewoman disguised in poverty, but as one of them. "Do you want to know how to make your letters sing?" she asked the smallest girl. The child nodded, and just like that, every evening after supper, Florence began to teach. The parish allowed her the back room, bare and cold but dry. She gathered a few broken slates, some discarded copybooks, and began with the alphabet, then the Lord's Prayer, then little poems. The children came quietly at first, then in clusters, their hands ink-stained, their cheeks ruddy from the wind, but their eyes wide with hunger for knowledge. It gave her purpose. It gave her breath. She did not speak of Caramore, not to Mrs. Tilly, not to the children, not to the priest who offered her chalk and a spare oil lamp when hers began to dim. That part of her life she sealed, like a letter never sent. But silence, she had learned, does not always protect. One damp morning, she walked into the glove shop to find Mrs. Tilly holding a folded notice in her flour-dusted fingers, brows furrowed. "A man came by," she said without looking up. "Left this, didn't stay." Florence took the page with cautious fingers. It was a clipping, a handbill actually, circulated across the poor wards. A warning, beware of the girl who plays at lady. Cast out from the houses of nobility for her sins. She teaches your children, but what does she teach them? There was no name, but there was no need for one. She felt the old sickness rise in her throat, shame not deserved but familiar, the weight of falsehood clinging to her like smoke that would not wash away. Mrs. Tilly said nothing, but the next morning she locked the front door and looked Florence straight in the eyes. "Some men are so weak they need to destroy a woman to feel tall again," she said simply. "The fact that they fear you says more than the words on that paper." Florence could not speak, only nodded, and when she turned to leave, her heart shook, but her spine held straight. That night, one of the children brought her a letter. "Lady at the gate," the girl whispered, "said it was for you." Florence unfolded the paper slowly. The handwriting was unmistakable, rounded, careful, as though shaped by small fingers. The drawing was simple, a castle with windows, but the windows were different. They had eyes, ears, and above them, in crooked lettering, the castle listens. A lump formed in her throat that no words could swallow. Below the sketch, 2 small words had been written with childish concentration. From Nora. No signature, just that. But it was enough to warm her in a way the parish fire never could. A week later, another envelope arrived, this one sealed, the wax pressed with a coin, not a crest. The letter was from Mrs. Kavanagh. The tone was clipped but unmistakably protective. "We know what was done. Not all believe it. The truth has a way of surfacing, if not by words, then by consequence. Hold your ground, Miss Whitby. The house remembers you." Florence read the letter twice, then tucked it inside her coat over her heart. She never replied. Instead, she poured herself into the schoolroom. She taught with greater conviction, fiercer passion. She introduced poetry to the older children, led Bible recitations with the younger ones, and stayed late after dark to help one boy who refused to speak, but drew pictures that told stories no words ever could. And while she taught, while she mended gloves by lamplight and endured the occasional whisper on the street, her stepfather's schemes began to unravel.
The parish priest, a stoic man named Father Hashley, had grown suspicious of the papers Bowles' men had circulated. He sought out Florence's former employers in Dublin, uncovered the letters that once offered her references, letters which contradicted the slander now being spread. He confronted the man in question in the presence of witnesses, and when the stepfather could no longer spin lies to cover his past misdeeds, his gambling, his debts, his abandonment, he fled, gone, no farewell, no retraction. But in his absence, the silence spoke louder than guilt. Florence never rejoiced. She did not dance in her victory, nor weep in relief. Instead, one morning she stood before her class, chalk in hand, and wrote on the board a single word, worth. She underlined it once, then said softly, "This is not given to you. This is not taken from you. This you claim for yourself." The children watched her wide-eyed and still. That night, when she lit her lamp and sat alone at her table, Florence did not think of the Duke.
She did not think of Lady Honora, or the brooch, or the cold sting of dismissal. She thought of her mother, of a voice that once said, "Let your strength be quiet, child, but never invisible." And with her needle, her slate, her breath, Florence would be vowed. Never again would anyone write her story for her. She would write it herself, word by word, line by line, until no one could erase it. The air at Caramore had changed, not with the seasons, but with the weight of something shifting, something cracking beneath the surface, long buried and now too loud to silence. The halls no longer echoed with gentle routines or careful deceptions. They pulsed with the tremors of reckoning. Behind every polished door, every velvet drape, lay truths too long hidden, and they had begun to rise like embers beneath ash, catching wind. In the Duke's private study, sunlight filtered through tall windows, streaking the dust-laced air with pale beams. Alistair O'Connell stood alone, a ledger open before him on the desk. His hands, steady in Parliament, sure in battle, trembled faintly as he turned the page. Numbers, names, dates. But behind every figure lay something more damning. Silences where there should have been signatures, altered entries in the margins, and payment lines ending in names he had never authorized. He had known, somewhere beneath his dignity, his grief, his well-constructed remove, he had known. But knowing and facing are not the same, and now face it he must. Boyle's final betrayal had not been the brooch. That had only been the blade. The true wound lay in the years of quiet theft, the cruel enforcement of rents, the dismissals and evictions carried out in the Duke's name while he buried himself in solitude and noble silence. The storm began with a single letter. An anonymous tenant, braver than most, had written to the estate solicitor detailing forged collection records and threats made on behalf of his grace. The solicitor, unwilling to proceed without proof, had shown it to Alistair. Alistair had spent the night reading every page, every line. By morning, he had summoned Mr. Pierce. "Open the ledgers," he said. "To everyone, tenants, press, parish, no more curtains." Pierce had stared at him, as if trying to decipher whether this was defiance or confession. "It will be seen as weakness," he warned. "No," Alistair replied, cold and clear. "It will be seen as justice." Within days, the countryside hummed with the news. The Duke of Carrigamore had called for a full review of his lands, his stewards, his books. He had issued a letter of formal apology to his tenants, printed without flourish or shield. No man of conscience can rule in ignorance and call it dignity. He did not mention Florence, not by name, not in print, but her shadow stretched over every page. The investigation moved quickly. Mr. Boyle's handwriting was found across at least 3 forged clearance orders. Witnesses came forward, former tenants, housemaids, even a dismissed footman who remembered Boyle's heated arguments behind closed doors. And then came the brooch.
Mrs. Kavanagh, in her quiet and methodical way, retrieved the inventory of servant quarters from the night in question. The handkerchief used to wrap the brooch belonged to a kitchen maid, dismissed 3 months prior. A maid with ties to Lady Honora's household. That was the final stone. Boyle was arrested without ceremony. His protests rang hollow, his alliances scattered. Lady Honora, for all her social graces, departed Caramore 2 days later under the guise of visiting a cousin in Geneva. She left behind no farewell, no explanation, only the bitter perfume of ambition undone. But even justice, when done late, does not mend all wounds. One morning as the frost began to melt from the edges of the windows, and the sun dared break through the heavy skies, Alistair stood alone in the garden he had once allowed to wither. The path led nowhere. He turned toward the gate. In Dublin, the city moved with its usual haste. Coaches rattling over slick stone, vendors shouting beneath soot-streaked awnings, chimney sweeps clambering up like shadows. Florence, seated in the back room of the parish schoolhouse, was guiding a young boy's finger along the shape of the letter S. She did not hear the carriage wheels. She did not see the figure that stood at the door until the priest cleared his throat softly and inclined his head. Alistair O'Connell removed his gloves as if unsure what to do with his hands. The room fell silent. Children turned. Chalk paused mid-stroke. Florence looked up. She did not stand. Her voice was even.
"This is a schoolroom, Your Grace." Alistair bowed his head. "May I speak with you?" Her gaze was calm. "After the lesson." He nodded and stepped back, waiting beyond the door as the children gathered their slates and copybooks. Florence dismissed them with a soft clap and turned to extinguish the oil lamp, her back to him longer than necessary. When she stepped into the corridor, the air between them felt impossibly heavy. "I've come to apologize," he began, "though I know the words are late." "They are," she said, "but that does not mean they are unwanted." He breathed in slowly. "Everything you said, everything you refused to say was right." She looked at him, then truly looked. His coat was dusted from travel, his cravat slightly loosened. He looked like a man who had not slept, not truly, not since the night he had let her walk away. "Boy has been arrested," he said. "The papers have printed it. The tenants know. The records have been cleared." "Your name? My name," she interrupted softly, "was never yours to erase nor to restore." The words hung between them like the hush before a verdict. He nodded once, accepting the weight of them. "I came," he said, after a long silence, "because there was something I never told you." She tilted her head, silent. "The letters," he continued, his voice quieter now, "the ones you found. There was one you never read, or perhaps you saw only a line." Florence did not reply. He stepped closer, but not too close, just enough that his voice could fall like a secret between them. "If something happens, promise me you will not let them turn you to stone." She breathed in. "He knew," he said. "Even then, Maeve, he knew I would try to survive by hiding, by closing every door. He knew I would call it honor when it was fear." His voice broke just slightly. "And then you came," he whispered, "and you were not loud. You were not proud, but you looked at me as if I were still a man, not a title, not a ruin, a man." She looked away, blinking hard. "And when I failed you," he added, "it wasn't because I didn't believe you. It was because I still believed too much in walls, in silence, in exile." The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything not yet healed. Florence finally spoke. "What are you asking of me?" He looked into her eyes, stripped of armor, of pretense, of control. "I am not asking you to return," he said, "not as a servant, not as a shadow. I am asking if you can forgive the man who once stood behind the title." She was quiet for a long moment.
Then, with a voice that trembled with truth, she replied, "I never needed you to be a duke," she said. "I needed you to be brave." He swallowed. "And if I try to be that now?" She looked at him, at the man, not the title, and for the first time her eyes softened. "Then we speak," she said, "but not in whispers, not in corners. If we are to speak at all, let it be with truth, in full light." He exhaled, a sound like relief wrapped in regret. "Then let it begin." And though no promises were spoken that day, something passed between them, a slow thought, a flicker, an ember refusing to die, the kind of truth that asks nothing but presence and the courage to remain. The wind had changed again, not the cruel bite of winter that once chased Florence down the cobbled streets of Dublin, but a restless, pulsing wind that tugged at branches, pressed against windows, and warned of something coming. The hills of Carrymore had begun to stir, not with voices, but with a tension that rippled through the village like water before a storm. Florence had not planned to be there that day. It was market day, and Mrs. Tilly had asked her to deliver a parcel of repaired gloves to a merchant outside the estate grounds. The path from Dublin had been long, but Florence had walked it with a steady heart and eyes unafraid. She did not hide her face beneath the bonnet, nor did she lower her gaze when passing neighbors who once crossed streets to avoid her. Carrymore had already changed, and so had she. It was near the churchyard that she heard it, a scream, not loud, but sharp, piercing, a cry not born of pain, but of terror. Smoke followed, black and rising fast, curling above the rooftops of the schoolhouse in thick, choking waves. Bells began to toll, not from the church tower, but by hand, frantic, uneven, urgent. Florence dropped the parcel at once and ran. When she reached the schoolyard, people had already begun to gather, mothers shouting names, men forming a chain to pass buckets from the well. But the flames had leapt fast, fed by dry wood and wind. One side of the building was already lost, the roof sagging in places as embers danced like devils through the air. "The back room," someone cried. "3 children are still inside." Florence did not think. She did not ask. She ran. Voices tried to stop her. A hand caught her sleeve, but she tore away. The front door was blocked, smoke rolling out in angry breaths. She turned the corner and saw a side window, small, high, but shattered. A stable boy had broken it open with a rock, his arm bleeding. Florence boosted herself through the frame, the jagged edge slicing her skirt. Inside was chaos. Heat pressed against her skin like a hand intent on punishment. The air was thick with soot and the smell of scorched paper. Desks had been overturned in panic. The back room was visible only by the faint outline of a door, half ajar. She pulled a damp cloth from her pocket, meant for the market, now pressed to her mouth, and pushed forward. The children were huddled beneath a desk, 2 boys and a girl, their faces streaked with ash, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that steals breath before it can form a scream. "It's all right," she whispered, hoarsely, though her throat burned. "Come with me." One boy, the smallest, would not move. "My brother," said the girl. "He won't leave him." Florence crouched low.
The heat clawed at her back. "What's your name?" she asked the boy. He didn't answer. She recognized him. Son of the tenant Alistair had once evicted. She remembered his eyes from a night long ago when they looked up at her through a window as the family cart rattled down the road. "Can you take my hand?" she asked softly. Still nothing, so she dropped to her knees, lowered herself until their foreheads touched, and whispered, "There's music outside, the kind the castle forgot. If you come with me, I'll help you find it." His fingers reached for hers. They ran. The smoke fought back, thick and blinding. Florence wrapped her arms around the 2 boys, guiding the girl ahead until they reached the window. Someone was shouting her name from outside now, though she couldn't tell who. Hands pulled the children out, strong hands.
She felt them slip from her grip one by one until she was alone again. The fire cracked behind her, beams groaning like ghosts, remembering how to fall. She turned back toward the room just to be sure, and that's when the ceiling gave way. A scream erupted from the crowd as flames swallowed the rear corner of the schoolhouse. But a figure stumbled through the smoke, clothing scorched, hair blackened at the edges, but upright. Florence collapsed into the arms that caught her. She didn't know who they were. She didn't need to. Her body trembled. Her hands were burned. Her skirt was in tatters. And still she whispered one word. "They're safe." Rain began to fall not long after. Cold, steady, and slow, as if the sky, ashamed of its delay, had finally remembered how to weep. Florence sat beneath the overhang of the church, wrapped in a rough woolen cloak. Her skin was streaked with soot. Her lips chapped. Her lungs roared from the smoke. And then she saw him, Alistair. He walked across the muddy yard like a man emerging from memory, his coat soaked, his boots caked in earth, his eyes searching. He found her. He did not stop at a distance. He knelt before her. No title, no guards, no servants, just a man, bareheaded in the rain, reaching for the hand of a woman he had once dismissed. She looked at him, and something in her stilled. He did not speak at first. Then, quietly, "I came the moment I heard." She said nothing. "I read the names of the children," he continued. "The boy Patrick is the son of Seamus O'Dow." She nodded. "I know." "I cast them out," Alistair whispered, shame catching in his throat. "And you saved his son." "You believed silence was protection," she replied, her voice raspy. "But silence lets rot take root." He bowed his head. "I have no words to undo what I allowed," he said. "I won't offer apologies. They're too easy, too late." Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something far deeper, a grief that had learned how to breathe. "I'm not here to be restored," she said. "I've already done that myself." He looked at her, then truly looked, at the burns on her hand, the blood at her temple, the soot that lined her collar, and at the strength behind her pain. "I never asked for your forgiveness," he said softly, "and I won't ask now." "Then why are you here?" "Because," he whispered, "I want the chance to earn your presence every day, not as a duke, not as a man offering refuge, but as one willing to stand beside you wherever you choose to stand." The rain fell between them. A hush followed. Florence's breath trembled. She had no answer yet, no vows, no certainty. But she reached for his hand, and he let her see the fear in his eyes, not of fire, not of shame, but of hope. And that, she understood, was courage. The bells of Caramore did not ring with grandeur that morning, nor did carriages line the roads in procession, nor did noble guests in plumed hats descend upon the chapel like hawks upon ceremony. But the sun rose gently, the mist lifted from the hills as if granting a rare blessing, and in the small stone chapel behind the rose garden, the pews were filled with faces weathered by wind and work. Tenant farmers, stable boys, seamstresses, kitchen maids, and shepherds who had once feared the name O'Connell, but had come now to witness a union not of title, but of choice. Florence Whitby stood at the foot of the aisle in a gown of dove-gray muslin hemmed with lace that had once belonged to her mother. There were no jewels in her hair, only a simple braid, wrapped low across her crown. Her eyes held no tears, only that still trembling light that belongs to those who have seen storms and chosen still to love. Across from her, Alistair wore his formal coat, brushed and buttoned, but absent of medals or tokens of power. The gold pin at his collar was gone, replaced by a modest sprig of rosemary, Florence's request. When the priest spoke, he did so plainly. There were no grand declarations, no lofty oaths, only the words that mattered. Do you take this woman not as a reward, not as salvation, but as your equal, your truth, your vow? I do, Alistair answered, his voice unshaken. And do you take this man not as a title, not as a shield, but as your companion, your courage, your home? I do, Florence replied. No thunder clapped, no choir sang, but in the stillness that followed, Nora ran down the aisle barefoot, arms outstretched, giggling with a joy too large for ceremony. She stopped at the couple's side, took both their hands, and declared with solemn delight, "The castle hears better now." The room once filled with silence erupted in soft, warm, and real laughter. Later in the garden, Florence stood beneath the great ash tree, watching as children chased dragonflies between rows of lavender. The schoolhouse, a modest structure with tall windows and a roof that still smelled of tar, had opened its doors that week. Already its chalkboards bore verses and arithmetic. She had named it the Open Ear. Mrs. Kavanagh had returned to Caramore to oversee household accounts, but now reported not to the Duke alone, but to a council of elected tenants. Alistair had insisted upon it, his voice unwavering at the first meeting. I no longer trust in solitude. Each week, 3 seats rotated among the villagers. Rent adjustments, repairs, and harvest plans were no longer dictated. They were decided. Lady Honora had vanished as quickly as she had once glided through corridors. Her family's fortune, strained by legal challenges and social whispers, could no longer support her extravagance. It was said she boarded a steamship to Vienna, where salons still remembered her name, though few cared to hear it now. Mr. Bowles' trial had concluded publicly, with little drama and no fanfare. Fraud, bribery, and falsification of estate records. The courtroom had not gasped when the sentence was delivered. 3 years in prison. But the headline that followed drew breath across the county. A maid's honor, a duke's redemption.
Florence read the paper once, then placed it in the hearth. She did not need ink to confirm her story. One afternoon, Florence stood at the edge of the western terrace as dusk fell like silk across the land. Beside her, Alistair rested his hand gently on the stone balustrade, his thumb brushing hers in rhythm, no longer unsure. Below them, tenants arrived, bearing baskets not of tribute, but of thanks. Eggs, honey, linen, jam. A boy shyly offered a carved wooden bird. A woman kissed Florence's hand and whispered, "For not forgetting us." Nora wove between them like thread through cloth, her hair unpinned, her dress grass-stained, her smile wide enough to pull down clouds. Florence turned toward the man beside her. He did not speak. He didn't need to. For once the silence between them was full of peace. She touched the locket at her throat. It had once been her mother's, her only possession when she was cast out in disgrace. Now it gleamed in the setting sun, polished by time, touched by ash, and no longer heavy with grief. Inside it was a scrap of parchment, a line she had finally read in full. "If something happens, promise me you will not let them turn you to stone. Not you, not my daughter." Florence had carried that promise in every breath since, not just for her mother, for herself.
and now as laughter echoed from below, and Caramore stood not as a fortress, but as a home, Florence knew the truth. She had not been saved. She had stayed, and in staying, she had changed everything. Caramore. Spring of 1870. The roses bloomed early that year. A soft, gentle spring had arrived like a memory returning home, unexpected, tender, and welcomed with quiet wonder. The stone walls of Caramore were warmer now, softened by ivy and thyme. Children's laughter floated freely through the corridors where only echoes had once lived. And on the western terrace, where silence had once ruled, the sound of life now reigned. Florence stood there once more. Her hair was longer now, touched at the temples by streaks of silver the sun chose to gild instead of hide. She wore no corset, no jewels, just a blue cotton dress with sleeves rolled at the elbows and a small ink stain on her thumb. In one hand she held a folded letter, in the other a flower just plucked by small fingers that still carried the scent of earth. Behind her the school had tripled in size. The council had grown, and the house, no longer feared as the seat of a grieving duke, had become a living heart in the center of the village. "Ma," called a voice behind her, "she won't let go of the chalk." Florence turned. Two figures came bounding across the grass. Nora, now 14, wild as the wind, and beside her a smaller girl with curls dark as midnight and a temper to match. "Maisie," Florence called gently, crouching to her knees, "did you take the chalk again?" The girl stopped short. "No," she said, hiding both hands behind her back. Florence raised an eyebrow. Maisie sighed. "It was just one piece." Florence opened her arms, and the child rushed in. Alistair watched them from a distance, one hand resting on the cane he now used not out of weakness, but to steady a leg once injured during a storm relief effort years ago. His hair had gone fully silver, his voice had grown quieter, but his gaze, when turned to Florence, remained unchanged, anchored by love, and softened by years of choosing it daily. They had not sought greatness, they had sought truth, and in doing so, they had found peace. After their wedding, Florence had chosen not to be styled Her Grace, despite the protests of society. She remained Mrs. Whitby O'Donnell, in letters and in person. It was a quiet rebellion, one of many. They had 3 children, Maisie, Thomas, and the baby still in the cradle, Maeve, named after the ghost of a woman Florence had never known, but had come to understand. The letter in her hand was from a former student, now a teacher in Dublin. He wrote of opening a school based on hers, of teaching tenant boys to read without punishment, of girls now encouraged to hold pens. Florence had cried when she read it, alone in the pantry where no one could see. Not all stories had ended sweetly. Lady Honora had returned from Vienna only once, her fortune gone, her beauty faded. She came not to reclaim affection, but to beg forgiveness. Florence had listened, had offered tea, but no invitation to stay. Honora died in Paris the following year, alone, her name mentioned only in gossip columns. Mr. Bowl, upon release from prison, had vanished into the north. Whispers claimed he lived under another name. Alistair never sought him. Florence never spoke of him. Some ghosts were better left unresurrected. And Nora, oh Nora, no longer the fragile girl who once feared closed doors, she had become a force. At 14, she spoke Latin, argued politics at supper, and refused to wear gloves unless it was her idea. She wrote poems, terrible ones,
but they were hers. That afternoon, the family gathered in the field behind the school for a planting ceremony. 10 new saplings to honor 10 years of the council. Florence held baby Maeve as Alistair gave a short speech, measured, honest, laced with dry humor. As they began to dig, Thomas, 5 years old and serious as a banker, asked, "Mama, why do we plant trees when people can't live forever?" Florence looked at her son, then at her husband. "Because," she answered, "trees remember, even after we're gone." That night, when the house had quieted and only the hearth still whispered, Alistair found Florence sitting at her writing desk. "I saw you reading Maeve's letter." "Again?" Florence nodded. "She wrote about stone, and I became fire." "You became you," he said, kneeling beside her. "I stayed, and you changed everything." He kissed her hand, the same one he had once let go. Outside, the wind rustled through the leaves planted by hands now calloused with joy.
Caramel would never be what it once was, because love, when chosen freely, becomes a legacy. And Florence Whitby, the girl once cast out in shame, had not only stayed, she had built something that would outlive them all. Every castle has its ghosts, every heart its silence. But sometimes all it takes is one woman who refuses to break, who dares to stay, to turn stone into sanctuary. Florence's journey wasn't paved with miracles, it was built slowly, choice by choice, scar by scar. She was cast aside, humiliated, silenced, and yet she never surrendered her dignity. She walked through fire, not to be rescued, but to rescue herself. And in doing so, she rewrote the fate of an entire world that once rejected her. Let this be the story that reminds us you are not what they say you are what you choose to become. If you felt something stir in your chest while listening, if you held your breath during the vows, or smiled when Nora said, "The castle hears better now," then this story became yours too. Tell us in the comments what part moved you the most. And if you made it to the end, write the word resilience below. It's our quiet way of knowing you were here with us until the very last line. If this tale left a mark on your heart and you'd like to help us continue creating more emotional, powerful period dramas like this one, consider leaving a super thanks with any amount you wish. It helps us sustain this channel and keep telling the stories that matter. But if you can't contribute financially right now, we understand completely. Sharing this video with a friend or on social media is another beautiful way to support us. And if you're craving more stories like this one, don't miss the narrations I've linked right here in the cards. Each is waiting to transport you to another time, another heart, another chance at redemption. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being part of this story. We'll see you in the next video.